This is the lesson video for lesson 2.09, Evolution and Earth History.
So what we're going to be talking about in this lesson is the origin of life. Where did life come from, and what is some evidence that we have that that's how life originated? So scientists think that the atmosphere of early Earth contained very little oxygen gas. And remember, oxygen is something that we rely on, right? It's a necessity today. Okay, so scientists believe that in the early Earth, there was very little oxygen gas, so obviously it looked very different than what it looks like today. However, once photosynthesis evolved or came about, oxygen levels in the atmosphere began to increase. So why does oxygen levels in the atmosphere increase with photosynthesis? Remember, in photosynthesis, right, we produce glucose and we produce oxygen. These are two things that photosynthesis produces. So if photosynthesis evolved, then that means oxygen levels would increase because we are producing oxygen. So if the early Earth did not have as much oxygen, then that means that the organisms that lived during that time must have not relied on oxygen to live like we do today. When we have organisms that do not rely on oxygen, we call them anaerobic. Remember, aerobic means requiring oxygen, so an means without. So it does not require oxygen. However, just as we said before, when we had photosynthetic organisms evolving, they began to produce oxygen because photosynthesis produces oxygen. So then the concentration of O2 in the atmosphere began to increase. So the first evidence of life. So obviously we can't say definitively when life began, but the first evidence of life on Earth are from fossils that are about 3.5 billion years old. Early in Earth's history, the area that is now Western Australia was home to some of the first life forms on the planet. These organisms are called cyanobacteria. And the reason why we know that they existed that long ago is because they left behind these solid structures called stromatolites. And stromatolites are built by these bacteria organisms, and how they build it is by trapping sediments from the soil, and then that becomes fossilized. And when scientists date back these fossils, they date it back to 3.5 billion years ago. So again, these fossils are the earliest fossils that we know of. So if we were to look back on what the first living organism looked like, scientists' best hypothesis is that we all came from a single cell organism. And so obviously, since we all came from somewhere, scientists believe that the single cell organism is the ancestor of all life on Earth. All life, including humans, evolved from this single cell organism. And we call this single cell organism a prokaryote, okay, which is a type of cell. This prokaryote had no nucleus and it didn't need oxygen to survive. Remember, we call that anaerobic. The reason why scientists believe that this prokaryotic cell is the ancestor of all life is because this life form used DNA as a genetic material. So although all the organisms that exist today are very different, they all have one commonality, which is that they all have DNA. So what they believe is that the first the first organism or the common ancestor of all life on Earth must have DNA as well. Later on, maybe around 2.7 or 1.5 billion years ago, we now had eukaryotic cells that were developing and evolving. And so these eukaryotic cells are more complicated because they have both a nucleus as well as organelles. Like their prokaryotic ancestors early, so this means the first types of eukaryotes with the nucleus and organelles, were also single-cell organisms. And it seems that evidence shows that in the next billion years, which is a very long time, eukaryotic cells remained as single-cell organisms. However, because these cells had nuclei, right, which is that control center in the cell, these cells became more complex, giving rise to multi-cell organisms. And some examples of these multi-cell organisms or organisms with more than one cell are plants and animals. So what we see here is that from this one single cell common ancestor, it gave rise to bacteria, archaea, plants, fungi, and even animals. And so obviously from this phylogenetic tree, you should see that we all came from one place. Scientists believe that we all came from one place, but then diverged from there. So here you can see that this is where the eukaryotes would begin developing. These two right here are prokaryotes. So scientists use fossil records as a means of evidence in proving the evolution of all life forms. And so you can see here, these are fossils from different time periods, right? Different eras. And you can see that as we get more complex, right? This would be the some fossils made by the bacteria, right? We see that here, this must be some sort of plant. And then we have different, more complex organisms here and here, right? And this is developing as time goes on further and further. One really key point that you need to know is how they can date these fossils. And so one really simple way that scientists date these fossils is that they look at where in the rock formations these fossils lie. So if they found a fossil in this area right here, this would be on the bottom, right? And so because it's on the bottom, it must be the oldest, because that means that after these organisms here were fossilized, then these were next, right? And then the top layer would be last. And if they're last, then that means that they would be the youngest fossils or the more recent organisms. The fossil record contains information about the rise of new species as well as the extinction of others. And so geologists look at those two things. So for example, they can see whole groups of organisms would disappear from the fossil record. And so they would call these mass extinctions, and mass meaning a really big one. Okay, meaning all the organisms disappeared at the same time or around the same time. What was very common was after a mass extinction of one organism, new kinds of organisms would then gradually come to be present in those rock layers. So if we were to look at some of the dramatic changes that happened over time, the first is that major groups of animals appear in the fossil record for the first time, and this would be around the Paleozoic era. Then somewhere around here, we had the greatest mass extinction with about 50% of the animal families, including 95% of all marine life, becoming extinct. right? And so, as we said, after a mass extinction, that's when we give rise to new organisms. Another dramatic change that geologists have found also was that around this time was another time that we had a mass extinction where we had many marine species and dinosaurs becoming extinct. When looking at fossil records, its transitional forms are actually very important. Transitional forms help geologists and scientists really piece together the big picture. So transitional forms, another way to explain it are intermediate stages in the evolution of life forms. And so they kind of help draw conclusions about how we get modern species from their ancestors. And so today's whales and dolphins have a particularly well-preserved fossil history with many, many transitional stages. And so from this evidence, scientists can see that organisms like whales and dolphins have actually originated from land-based ancestors. So they first were living on land and then evolved to be able to live in the ocean. Okay, and so here are some examples of what transitional forms would look like for a whale and a dolphin. Here are a series of transitional fossils unearthed in Pakistan that tells you the evolution of those whales and dolphins. So what we see is that first they had legs, right? And then they gradually lost those legs, right? They get smaller and smaller. And then they develop things like fins to help them swim. And so we see here that it's not just that one day they had legs and the next day they had fins, but that certain adaptations that were once useful on land but no longer in the water would disappear, and then other ones would appear. And so these transitional fossils again help scientists create a better story on how exactly these modern day organisms came about. Besides being able to say that certain fossils are older than others and just comparing them relatively, scientists have developed a way to date the age of fossils using radiometric dating. And so what radiometric dating is that it provides an absolute age. So not just this rock is older than another, but it can actually tell an approximate age of the rock. And so how it does that is it measures decay. And so there are certain atoms making up that element that changes over time. So basically what happens is depending on how much those atoms have changed, we can then calculate how old that rock is. So to summarize this lesson of evolution and Earth history, we can look at this diagram over here. So we focused today on learning about how the fossil record provides evidence. It's a form of evidence of the origin or beginning of life, right? It provides evidence of change over time, which we know is evolution. And it also provides evidence of when animals go extinct or completely die off, and speciation, when we have new species formed. Okay, so again, fossil records are really important because they really paint a picture of what the Earth looked like before we were here. So here's some important vocabulary that you should keep in mind. First, anaerobic. Remember, aerobic means oxygen, right? So anaerobic means not requiring oxygen. Fossils are the remains of ancient living things. Prokaryotes are organisms that are usually made up of a single cell, and they do not have a nucleus or any membrane-bound organelles. Eukaryotes are organisms made up of one or more cells, so it can be multicellular. It has a nucleus as well as membrane-bound organelles. We also talked about transitional forms like in the whales and the dolphins, and those are the intermediate stages in the evolution of life forms. And the last one was radiometric dating, and this was the way that we determined the absolute, not relative, but absolute age in years of geologic samples using radioactive isotopes, which remember we looked at the decay of certain atoms to figure out how old something is.